Hello, everyone. Don't know about you, but 2023 is an absolutely full-on year so far. It seems to be non-stop, and we've got some really cool topics to talk you through again today on another edition of iGaming Next Weekly News Live. Pierre is busy recording some interviews for the podcast. Nico Janssen, our good friend, is in a meeting with investors today, and Connor, who often joins me, is away on a spa day. Ryan, can you believe that?
Wow.
It's all right for some, isn't it?
Okay, nice.
So, unfortunately, our audience is stuck with the same lineup as last week. Me and our US editor, Ryan Butler. But they'll be pleased to know we have got a bit of a special guest later on lined up in the show. So stay tuned in. It's bound to get a lot more exciting as Phil Pearson is joining us very shortly to talk about DraftKings and DFS. I'm sure many of you know Phil from LinkedIn, and if you are watching on LinkedIn, please do comment in the chat box. It's great to follow along as you're watching, and hello to everybody that's tuned in for the start of today's show. Ryan, how are you?
I'm doing well. Another beautiful morning here in the US.
Good, lots to write about as always, I imagine. Okay, let's dive straight into our first topic. I just teased it there, but basically, this was the news this week that DraftKings, the massive US sports betting operator, has suspended its DFS operations in Europe, in countries including Austria, Germany, Ireland, and Malta. And I think we can bring Phil on right now if he's waiting in the background. Hello, Phil. How are you doing?
I'm in the background of every podcast, just waiting to be tagged in.
Thank you very much for joining us today. How are you?
Not a problem. I'm good. I wish I was on a spa day, but I'm all right.
I know we could all do with one, right?
I
think it's a two-day spa trip actually. So he's there today and tomorrow. Can you believe it? He won it whilst on a game show with Alan Carr.
Nice.
That was one of the prizes. They won about 20 prizes. He's been living it up ever since. Anyway, we're getting off topic. Should we talk about DraftKings and DFS?
Let's do it.
So, Phil, I think you had a bit of a world exclusive this week, did you? When you put the news on LinkedIn, you said your inbox was inundated with people who had only just found out that DraftKings was going to be closing its DFS in Europe.
No, I had like every media company in gaming asking me how I found out and whatever. But the truth of it is I play on their site a lot because I'm a big advocate for DFS. I think it's amazing. But I think I was literally the first person in the world to read that email because it popped up as I was on email. It came straight up and I was like, oh, shit. So then decided to tell iGaming about it because I thought it was kind of game-changing news, to be honest, if they're pulling out.
Yeah, exactly, and that's exactly what it was. And it was the first I'd heard of it, actually, seeing your post on LinkedIn. So, we were able to follow up on that and find out a few more details about the story. And I think this probably comes down to DraftKings' overall drive to kind of reduce costs and improve its profitability, because that's what it's been struggling with the last 2 years or so, and investors are getting a bit fed up with not seeing much of a return. But in terms of you, Phil, I guess you were just saddened to see the product go if you're a kind of regular player.
No, I know. I'm a big fan of the NFL, American sports in general, so it was a lot of fun for me. Plus, what they've done with like Premier League and fantasy football is really impressive. But for me, it's the only product of its kind that works in Europe. So the fact that they're giving up on the market, because obviously the interest level is a lot less than it is in the US, because the US sports are very data driven. I mean, they're powered by Amazon, US sports. But UK sports and European sports aren't the same kind of statistical games. So I reckon the level of interest here would be lower. But at the same time, I didn't really think it was that expensive to provide the service in Europe. I'm a bit surprised they've pulled out everywhere, especially in Ireland and Malta, which are big kind of gambling markets.
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting, actually. So for people who maybe aren't as familiar with DFS, which is obviously daily fantasy sports, contest. Am I right in thinking then you were playing on kind of European facing sports rather than the ones we would imagine in the US, so NFL and baseball and that kind of thing?
I was big into NFL. I'm a big NFL fan.
Okay.
I watch it religiously. That's the word. And
right.
I go up against all of the big people every week. I've won a couple, but nothing huge. But at the same time, it's incorporating every country because everyone that watches it can play on it as long as you're within one of the 8 markets. But the viewership's quite big, especially in the UK and Ireland.
Yeah.
So it is a bit shocking they've kind of removed all those players from those markets.
Yeah, shocking is the word. And I think what took most people by surprise was kind of how sudden this announcement was, and that it probably came a little bit out of nowhere because obviously you got the email beginning of this week, if I'm not mistaken, and then they've said they're urging customers to withdraw all funds before the 22nd of January. So big question, Phil, have you got your funds out?
Yes, I did. So to be fair, their customer service is exceptional. I'll give them critical emails within 5 or 10 minutes normally. The funds have been withdrawn. I mean, they sent the email at 10 to midnight on the 17th or the 16th, saying that by the end of the day coming up, so they literally gave 24 hours and 10 minutes to say to stop kind of playing or to withdraw your funds. And anything that wasn't completed by the 22nd, you have to approach the MGA for. So I'm sure the MGA is thrilled about the inevitable people coming to them for $25.
Yeah, a nice avalanche of admin for them to deal with that they weren't expecting. But yeah, I thought one line in our story said they were asking users to deposit another $5 just so that their latest account was linked and up to date to return customer funds. So that's a little bit cheeky. You could argue that might annoy a few customers, but
I think regulatory-wise, you have to. I think because of the closed-loop system. So my MLRO is going to love me for this, that I know this. But I think because you have to have a transaction on it to withdraw from it, I think it makes sense. But again, if they're just withdrawing, and in multi, you can't gamble. There's no sportsbook or casino. It's just daily fantasy. It's not like you can really money launder that much anyway. So I thought they'd have just let it pass. But seems not. They're going to make people deposit €5 to withdraw their funds.
Yeah. No, really interesting. And obviously you said as well, this was kind of the best version of this you've seen in Europe. Is there any other kind of company offering an experience that you can now go to with DraftKings closed down, or have you not explored that far yet?
I've had a look, so I was curious as to who the competition was in Europe. There's a couple of really small ones that don't actually do that much. But I think the biggest one that we have is Bet365. I think they partnered with Scout, or it might be Scout, I might be wrong. And they're offering kind of daily fantasy on their site, which is similar scoring, but the prize pools are obviously a lot lower. So on DraftKings, the prize in the one I was doing for the NFL was 1.5 million. And I think on Bet365, you're looking at, I think 3K, 4K. So the actual kind of RTP and the value in it is a lot lower now.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. Ryan, obviously you're based in the US. Do you have any questions to Phil about this topic, or what it might mean for DraftKings? I think we'll discuss strategics probably a little bit later once Phil has left. But yeah, what are your thoughts about the situation?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if it's just a company that's had a really tough financial year plus. Sometimes it's just cutting things just to cut things, and sometimes that deals with it too. It almost seems that they just we're getting into earnings season coming up, and it just, it's a frustrating one. I don't know exactly, like you said, what is the cost, but these are pretty strong gambling markets, especially like Ireland and Malta, exactly like you said. It is really surprising, and maybe just, again, the bottom line wasn't there. So it's a curious one. I feel bad for you guys. It's gambling is very weird here in the US, and in DraftKings and FanDuel have done a marvelous job portraying themselves as not gambling for their DFS products. So it's something that we can use, and it's as close as where I live in Florida. It's as close to kind of gambling on an NFL game as I can get, and I like to play those too. So I can imagine that would be a real frustration if we had to deal with that. So my final thought is just, Phil, I feel you.
It's not easy. I mean, if you've played it for a long time, there's a lot of people that you find that are in Europe that play it. There's hundreds of thousands of people on like Facebook groups and stuff. So it is, even if it's break even or just profitable, the fact they cut that rather than some of their 1 billion plus advertising spend that they have on partnerships with the NFL
Right.
and partnerships with coffee companies, and the amount of adverts they run, and they sponsor like NFL Red Zone, for example. They sponsor everything. So
Right.
the fact that they would cut out markets rather than trim overhead on advertising cost means, I would say, that they're looking at a heavy push. I mean, a merger if they're closing down that many things abroad, which is possible, or a buyout, but I can't see that coming.
Right. And again, then it opens up the whole speculation and the whole rigmarole. Does somebody, does a European major operator, a Bet365 or somebody come in and do that and try to get the DraftKings name similar to what Flutter did with FanDuel, which worked out very well for both those parties. So that, again, it might just keep those rumors going even more. It'll be interesting. Yeah. DraftKings is a bigger note too with it on just quickly on DraftKings is they are closing in on some really important decisions. Their bottom line is getting tough. Their cash burn is still really strong, even when their competitors are starting to turn a little bit more. They're getting a little bit better with it. Caesar's just talking about profitable quarters. FanDuel's already done it, obviously a little different there because they're Paddy Power Flutter. But DraftKings has got to start making some money here, or they could be facing some really tough decisions. And again, I think it all kind of ties into this. They're going to have, this was a tough one here, and maybe there's going to be more down the road.
Yeah, I think FanDuel probably a bit of an influence in this because they've never targeted anywhere outside of 25, 26 US states. So, I mean, unless they're going to partner over here and try and push into Europe. But again, our sports aren't kind of rhythmic with that kind of formula for sports as you have over there, which is kind of following is huge in America and less popular outside in the European countries, unless you watch American sports or soccer, as they would call it. Or as you would call it.
That's what we call it, right?
Exactly. Right. Let's take a little bit of a break there, guys, just to say hello to people in the chat. So hi to Katie and Lewis and Shanaz, and also to Richard, Phil, who asked a pretty important question at this time of year. Who will be coming to ICE?
Everybody. This year, everyone will come to ICE because there's no masks, there's no COVID. We have a big stand. We are welcoming anyone who wants to come. There is no loitering rules on our stand. You can come and do whatever you want. Well, within reason.
Yeah, loiter as much as you like. And you'll be there representing your new business, Phil, White Label Casinos. So it's probably quite a significant ICE for you.
Yeah, it's the first one we've kind of done separate from like the mother company, as it were. I mean, we're still shareholded by a gaming group, but we're more of a kind of unique separate entity now, so we can go and do whatever we want to do. We can market in the fun ways. For example, we have a 2.5 meter inflatable giant duck on the stand this year, which people are allowed to try and climb it as long as they're under 35 kilos. So that's probably not that many people. We're trying to have some fun. We're trying to make it a bit different because gaming is very, I mean, we look at it, gaming is very 18 plus. It's like enjoyable. It's something you do for fun. It's something you talk about. It's not as strict as people advertise it. So we're trying to change up the narrative a bit on how we promote the business. And for some reason, they let me loose on that. So some crazy stuff might happen. But no, ICE is going to be good. We're expecting like a lot of traffic. Should be 35,000 people there, I think.
Yeah, it's going to be a huge event, I think. Like you say, the first one where it's kind of a normal ICE after a few years, which people will be looking forward to. But yeah, if you want to speak to Phil, look for a giant inflatable duck, and me and Connor will be there as well, representing iGaming next. So if you want to meet up with us, please do get in touch. ICE fast approaching, which means we're getting towards the end of January, and that means, Phil, I'm going to put you on the spot now, like I have done with Ryan and Connor previously, and I'm going to ask you for one prediction for 2023, one iGaming industry prediction that will hold you to until the end of the year, and you can come back on and we'll see how successful you were.
I'm not Todd. I'm gonna. I should really have some of these planned. Mine's going to be regulatory based in that in some country somewhere something is going to happen that the regulator's power is marginalized. It becomes less. Because what they're doing, like if you look at the UK, if you look at Netherlands or anywhere, they are overstepping boundaries and going way too far. So I think at some point, a government or a union or something is going to actually make a difference with them. And there will be some players coming in. I think you might see the start of that in 2022, I hope. So I'm going to go a bit out there and say that at some point a regulator will come into some difficulties with some of their plans.
Okay. No, I think that's interesting. I think the UKGC in particular has faced some proper pushback recently, rather than just the everyday murmurings it's become accustomed to. I think people are getting a bit fed up with the kind of intrusive nature of what some operators are being asked from their customers. So I think that's a good prediction. Good shout. And yeah, we'll see by the end of this year. But Phil, I won't keep you much longer. It's a pleasure to have you on as always. And yeah, see you at ICE, I suppose.
Absolutely. I'll be there. Someone in the chat asked who's going to win the NFL. So the Kansas City Chiefs is the answer to that one. But no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's always fun to talk to you guys. So thank you.
Kansas City is a safe bet. It's not a bad one. Take care, Phil. It's good to chat.
Thanks. You guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
There we go, Ryan. NFL tips as well as iGaming insight.
I like it.
Yeah. So I think let's just go back to DraftKings before we move on. They had hinted very briefly at this kind of DFS withdrawal during their most recent Q3 2022 results. And it was just one line where CFO Jason Park said, in 2023, we expect gross margin to improve slightly relative to 2022 as we reduce promotional intensity, partially offset by new state launches. And then it says continued mix shift out of DFS. So I think that means they're basically altering the markets where they're going to be offering DFS, and then withdrawing from Europe is kind of the first we've seen play out of that this year.
Yeah, exactly. Again, like I said with Phil, I think they have to do something with it. They are facing some tough financial things, even harder than a lot of their competitors. And this is kind of one step with it. Again, we'll be covering that. I'm excited. It's going to be another huge earnings call coming up to see what they got going on. Be very curious to see how they did in Q4, which is so important. And for the U.S. sports books, that's where our busiest time of the year for betting. So there's a lot of it, and just important things coming up with it. And again, if DraftKings is not able to sustain itself as a company, which it has said it's hoped to be a foundational anchor leading U.S. sports betting and iGaming provider, it does become very enticing as a potential acquisition target. Again, that's rumors. Who knows? We've been talking about this for months and years and all that. But with that brand name, with all it's got going on, it's got its own in-house tech and everything with it. It'll be just very interesting to see what they move, how they do it, and what shareholders are going to respond to it.
Yeah, totally. And I think this whole issue of profitability, particularly in the US, first kind of came under the magnifying glass last year. But I think 2023 is when we're really starting to see some firms actually take action. And we're seeing, kind of how drastic these measures might have to be.
Yep.
And maybe closing DFS is a part of that. Phil said it was, small compared to their marketing spend, and it is, but maybe it's a case of every little helps right now.
Right. And again, sometimes it is.
Yeah, I think
sometimes cuts just look better on paper, even if they aren't practical. Even if they aren't it's just they can go to and say, "Hey, we are making these tough, important cuts in order to get our bottom line a little healthier."
Yeah, investors like the sound of that, I can imagine.
Right.
Because I think DraftKings are guided to basically making a loss for every quarter of 2023, hadn't it?
Right. It's same deal, similar to 2022, similar levels of loss. And again, coming when its competitors are saying we're going to start showing some profits in 2023.
Yeah.
And it's saying we will not.
Exactly, yeah. And crucially, FanDuel obviously said it would be profitable for full year 2023, which would be a first for any US sports betting operator. But I read some piece this week that said Morgan Stanley and their kind of leisure gaming analyst, Stephen Grambling, aptly named Stephen Grambling, he said that DraftKings might be profitable or might report a profitable quarter in Q2. And I think basically his rationale for that was how we've maybe not seen as many new state launches as they would have imagined, and that they've really kind of consolidated their share in the markets where they are currently live.
Yeah, that would be huge. I mean, that would be one of the biggest stories of the year if DraftKings was able to pull out a Q2 profitability. That'd be great news for them. An interesting thing with it is the California not passing their sports betting ballot measure that DraftKings spent tens of millions of dollars on, along with a couple other operators. That actually helps them narrow their runway for profitability. If they were in California, they would have to be. They'd be doing it now. If it had passed, it would have passed in November, so late mid Q4. They would be still spending so much money in California. California, a market of 40 million people. That would actually have to. It would be for everybody, DraftKings included. Their runway towards profitability would take even longer. This actually might push that up. So that'll be interesting. Again, this will be their first earnings call since the referendum officially failed. They were kind of projecting that it would. That were there with it. It's just another interesting thing to look at DraftKings. So yeah, with the only state launch that they'll have, they had Maryland in November, Ohio in January. They will have Massachusetts in March. That'll be a little bit later. And yeah, it has slowed down a little bit. And there'll be no more state launches coming until possibly Maine, which I don't even think DraftKings might not even be there. That's not going to be a very big market. And then you're looking at no more state launches until at earliest best case scenario would be September 2023, maybe even later. So again, maybe that does kind of help without huge state launches at DraftKings. One more note, they have been showing profitability in their iGaming markets. They've been showing profitability in their more established markets, their older ones and all that. So you can see that there with it. It's just they spend so much on their new markets. And then they obviously, as Phil said, they spend a lot on advertising, other sponsorships as well.
Yeah, no, precisely. And unfortunately, when companies are so concentrated on reducing their losses, improving profitability, that kind of thing, when you add the kind of economic environment to that at the same time, one of the unfortunate after effects of that is obviously redundancies, as they look to cut costs and basically trim staff that are kind of no longer deemed essential. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in just about every market at the moment. We've obviously documented in some detail some layoffs throughout Malta as Genesis Global has kind of fallen to pieces. But in the UK as well, developing story this week about Smarkets, which is an exchange operator predominantly, which has also dabbled in the US in Colorado. They made at least around 20 redundancies in their London office towards the back end of last year. And this won't really come as a surprise to anybody that's been monitoring the UK market closely, because the last 4 or 5 years, the cost of operation has basically skyrocketed. A little bit to do with what Phil was saying about the new Gambling Commission guidance, which has demanded really increased safer gambling measures and responsible gambling measures, but also kind of source of funds checks, affordability checks, and companies are really being judged now on how well they know their customers. And obviously all of that comes with huge costs to implement safer gambling teams with the requisite know-how. And when you're not making any money back from that because the regulations are tight, and you're kind of scaring off some of those higher value players that maybe don't want to give you their personal information, it makes it a very difficult situation. So something has to give, and unfortunately, in this case, it was redundancies.
Yeah, we're seeing this big headlines in the U.S. Microsoft laying off a significant portion of its workforce, a couple of percentage points, several thousand people. Big company, obviously. The tech going all that time, it's just we're looking at some tough economic headwinds. I am this morning and everything too. I'm getting nervous where we're seeing all the doomsday headlines about the debt ceiling in the U.S. and what that might mean for an economic catastrophe in the world. It's just it's a tough time here overall for a lot of operators, and you feel for it. It's tough. I think there was an exuberance, especially after the pandemic. There was a lot of tech stocks were booming. There was a lot of, the future is very digital. The future is remote. And we saw that at everything with it. A lot of engineering, a lot of tech people hired in all these fields. And now, as again, it's harder to borrow money. Things are getting more expensive. There's, again, concerns about long-term profitability for a lot of these tech companies. They're coming under more scrutiny about what they do and what their pathway is. I think you're seeing it. Correction is too strong a word, and I can't say that authoritatively on what's going on right now with it. But I think we're seeing this across the board. I think we'll touch on it too. We've seen with Bally's in North American Digital, their interactive division, we're seeing that too. And unfortunately, I think these aren't going to be the end of it. I think we might be looking at a period here where these become more common.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I don't think it's a worrying time right now. And like you say, 10,000 people, I think, were laid off from Microsoft. And that's just the jobs that Chat GPT is going to take over. So we shouldn't joke. But,
I'm worried about that too.
Yeah, we all should be. We all should be terrified. But no, let's zoom in a bit more on Bally's. I think that was a story that broke kind of overnight, certainly here in the UK, that I've written up today. So Bally's. Before we dive in, Ryan, let's look at where Bally's Interactive kind of sits in the US online ecosystem.
Hang on 1 second, Jake. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Perhaps we can sneeze with it. Yeah. So part of it, the biggest storyline, unfortunately, we have to look at with Bally's is that they come. I'll give it for a little background for people who aren't familiar with the band. They were a small, very small regional casino operator. Circa 2017, 2018, where they had a couple casinos and really no destination locations anywhere, just a small company. They were called Twin River Entertainment. They get the Bally's name from Caesars, and then starts a huge expansion where they do get a couple marquee properties, casino, and they spend a lot, hundreds of millions on this very aggressive digital expansion, including our local sports teams are broadcast on, we call it regional sports networks, or RSNs. They get a really big sponsorship deal, which was really kind of shocking to have a casino gambling company in the U.S. Sponsor sports. That was huge news for us back in 2017, 2018, 2019, around the time the Supreme Court struck down the federal wagering ban. So that name gets everywhere. People become more and more familiar with Bally's. The name itself had a sort of resonance as an older name, but has been affiliated with gaming in the U.S. for a long time. Anyway, so they spend all of these huge, big investments, these big deals and everything with it. And despite all of that, they have been a very small player in the U.S., an incredibly tiny player. Part of it was they said they were taking some time. They had acquired a European company for in-house tech, GameSys. With all that, they were integrating. They were going to get their new app, and then they were going to, we were going to integrate. Their leaders would say omni-channel through our promotions on the TV, through our sportsbook, through our iCasino, through our brick and mortar casinos, through all of this. We are going to, people are going to come to us because we're going to be everywhere, and you're not going to be able to avoid us. And actually, the people have been avoiding them. Bally's is just Bally Bet is just an afterthought, and really the big. Now again, U.S. is dominated by really three companies: FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM. Caesars is a solid fourth, and then you have your next tranche or wave or whatever with you. That's Barstool, BetRivers, and PointsBet. But those three companies there are single digits. And then you have everybody else who is just fighting for scraps, Bally's included. Now, again, they still say that very publicly they're very bullish, that they're going to have a future, that they're going to expand to more states. They're right now only in 6 states. And even some of their other competitors are in even more than that. I mean, Barstool's in a dozen, BetRivers is in more than that, PointsBet. And these are the types of companies they're competing with. They're not there. The RSNs, which these television networks are becoming big controversy too, about how Americans are shifting their consumption habits and away from cable and away from these sports packages, because the reality is most Americans do not want these RSNs. They don't watch sports. They don't care. So all these just confusions, these tough things with it. And again, I know that's a lot with it. It's just important to understand the Bally's story, how much they've grown and changed in the last 5 years. But it's not, at the moment, it is not coming back to market share. They, again, they aren't spending as much as some of their competitors on advertising and what have you, but they have spent a lot, and they are not, they're not making much noise in the U.S. despite these headlines, despite what us in the gaming industry are find very interesting. The average U.S. bettor is not going to Bally Bet. They are not going to Bally's. They are not doing what they their officials had hoped they would be doing. So I can, again, all ties in. You can see with the macroeconomic conditions as well, but you can see how Bally's would have to make some painful cuts at this time.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome context there, Ryan. Thank you for that. And the news today, obviously, is that they've decided to cut 15% of their US interactive division workforce as part of this kind of restructuring plan to reduce losses. So the interactive division, just quickly, consists of Bally Bet, which is the online sportsbook you talked about, the Bally Casino kind of digital brand, and then DFS, which is topical, as we've discussed, DraftKings with Monkey Knife Fight, which is kind of third in the market share for DFS in the US. Would you say they're a bit of a disruptor in that space?
And I forgot to mention them too. That was another big acquisition tool. I would say Monkey Knife Fight is probably the third. I mean, in the US, DFS, it is DraftKings, FanDuel, but yeah, you could say, I would say Monkey Knife Fight probably it has had a really strong niche audience in the US. It's done a really good job. So that was another big acquisition. They had done everything you could think with it. A big DFS, again, a big in-house tech acquisition, these sponsorships with the sports networks, but it's just for a lot of reasons it hasn't panned out.
Yeah. So what I thought was interesting, right? You've got a public company like this, obviously telling its investors that it's going to make layoffs to save costs. It didn't say how much they think this process is going to save them, but it did say that it's going to cost them 15 million to basically let go of everybody. So I'm not sure how that's going to help, particularly in the eyes of investors. But you interestingly, you mentioned a correction earlier, and you said a correction might not be quite right. But this quote from Bally's chief executive, Lee Fenton, I thought was incredibly interesting. He said, "The pandemic boosted our business and we continue to hire at full pelt. I now can see that we may have overhired in some areas, and I take full responsibility for that," which is interesting for several reasons. One is because I think that's probably quite common in this industry.
Yeah.
The second bit is that he's actually saying the quiet part out loud, if you like, because I don't think anybody else has acknowledged that, and they probably, blame the economic environment for these layoffs, or they've hidden behind other various economic curtains, rather than coming out and saying, perhaps we should have been more careful whilst riding that crest of the wave of COVID, if you like.
Yeah, again, that's why I'm hesitant to be careful. The correction is a term; it's an official look at it. But when you have officials and you have the publicly traded companies saying it, I mean, you see it. They're are at least getting things back right with it. I want to be careful again with our word choice there. So yeah, we'll see. They probably it's when you're not making much money at all, and you have big economic headwinds coming your way. You can see why. That's the first thing. The most expensive thing is unfortunately is employees, and humans are the ones that end up bearing the brunt of these economic issues. These stocks, these publicly traded companies. It's so far it's just kind of the reality of where we are.
Yep, unfortunately. And just to add some numbers to this story, so for Q3 2022, the North America Interactive segment posted a loss of $23 million. And then I think their performance in New York is particularly interesting. So they're one of the 9 licensed brands in New York, Bally Bet. And despite the market launching last January, I think they only managed to get live in July. And so far, they've generated less than $400,000 in revenue from New York. And Ryan, how much is it for a license for online sports betting in New York?
It's $10 million or something like that. I forget off the top of my head, but they also I forget is that revenue before or after the taxes? New York has a 51% tax rate on gross gaming revenue without promo deductions. So
that's GGR.
That and it's just that plus they're fighting with Resorts World Bet, which isn't even. I mean, it's there. It's one of the 9, but it's almost just kind of like a placeholder. It was just there as like a Resorts World. It's a different getting and all what they're doing. It's just a whole. So the Bally Bet can't even. I mean, they're getting less than like 1% market share in a 9-person market when it's really 8-person. It's just they are doing very poorly. And what's essentially an important state, and they're just not getting anything with it. It's brutal.
Yeah. It's interesting turning it on its head as well, because GamesHis historically, which is the company that the European company you mentioned that merged with Bally's, were a really successful, profitable UK-based listed gaming company that had quite successful casino operations in Asia as well. And obviously, like we've discussed, 4 years ago, whenever it was, you had to go into the US if you were public. That was all anybody was talking about. And they could be another company similar to Supergroup that we've discussed, where they might be kind of regretting letting their investors dictate their strategic path. But what choice do these companies had? I think it's only kind of coming out in the wash now that if you're a private company, like we've seen with Bet365, Tipico biding their time, maybe that was the right play after all.
Yeah, or it's again, those are a little different exemptions where they might be able to do something big with it. The problem was when you jumped in a little too late, and I think we saw that. DraftKings and FanDuel were there from day one. As soon as May 18th, or May 2018 was when the U.S. sports betting opened up and the floodgates sort of began. And it's sort of like you either had to have been on the ground there immediately, in which they were. So we had DraftKings and FanDuel, which obviously had the DFS and were huge players with it. You had BetMGM and Entain they got in very early as well. They were there in 2018. They were ready to go. They announced BetMGM in 2018. So they're there with it. And then Caesars, William Hill, which, William Hill had actually had a pretty strong presence in the U.S. It was one of the bigger sportsbook operators in the U.S. before PASPA. So they had a little foothold then too. And we're seeing nobody else has made huge progress otherwise. PointsBet is a really impressive company. I think their product is different. The whole concept of points betting is very interesting, but they were there pretty early, but they're struggling. Bet Rivers, which is a solid product, and they have a pretty strong presence in the U.S. and key markets, they're struggling. Penn Entertainment and Barstool, again, kind of that different approach where we'll get the media personalities and all that. Again, struggling is a relative term. Those three companies have a different idea than the other four. But even then, you see that those 7 companies that I've mentioned a couple times already, they have 90+% market share, and everybody else is, again, just fighting for scraps. So it's going to be hard to come in. I do think a Bet365 is got a potential because of everything with it. Tipico is very interesting now, where they've kind of come on late. See what they're going to do with it. But even another one I think that was established, we don't talk about it, but is Churchill Downs and Twin Spires. Twin Spires was one of the only gambling options we had in the U.S. where they had horse racing, and it was relatively well known. A lot of people had those accounts around our big horse races. It's not as big as maybe in Ireland or UK, but the big races do get attention. Anyway, you thought with their resources, but they had the casinos, they had essentially a mobile app already. They exited the market pretty quickly. Wynn, which kind of thought also might have a chance there. They had some marquee casinos in the U.S. They had a very big glitzy advertising campaign with Ben Affleck and Shaquille O'Neal. They reassess their strategy with it. And again, it's hard to get there. There's only so many pieces of the pie, and we're seeing that a couple people are dominating, and it's hard for anyone else to really get their foot in the door.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point that you make as well, is that companies like Bally's and GameSys, they weren't there from day one, but they also didn't wait until the chaos had died down. They're kind of in that awkward in-between stage where the kind of sentiment began to change. And yeah, they're obviously kind of paying the price for that a little bit at the moment, as we see. Not that they were to know that at the time, of course. Right, Ryan, I think we've probably just got one more story to touch on quickly. And when US operators are talking about profitability and saving every penny they can, what they don't want is huge enforcement action and fines being imposed on them by regulators. Which is what we've seen this week with a few sportsbooks, but most recently Caesars Sportsbook, I think. Do you want to talk us through this story?
Yes, I liked what Phil was saying earlier, where it's interesting where they had, following Europe, you go huge, I will use correction, where, there's the big crackdown on European regulators after, years of kind of wild gambling, whatever you want to call it, and then all that. And then maybe there's that pushback with it. US is interesting. We've kind of in the Wild West in a way, where our first few years after sports betting, and now I think our tide is turning towards the regulators, and they are starting to flex their muscles here. And this is the latest example in Ohio. So yeah, $150,000 fine, which in and of itself is nothing. Caesars didn't even argue it. It's not worth their time. That's a rounding error to them. They can't even waste. They spend, since I started talking, they have spent $150,000 on ads and free bets and all that. But this is important for the symbolism of it, where Ohio, which launches January 1st, is a big state, is an important one, an important market, a big population, big sports teams, all that, all you have with it. They come in and go, no, we're going to take this very seriously. And Caesars was specifically cited for not having a conspicuous problem gambling number and for using the term free bet and risk-free bet, which I want to talk about as well a little bit separately there. But it shows it to Massachusetts, which has gotten a lot of attention, another big population state, big sports teams. They are going under the most rigorous regulatory standards we've seen of any state of 30 plus. They're going very intense with it. Maine, which is a smaller state we touched on earlier, but they also are kind of following that Massachusetts model. We are going to see this more and more. States are going to, I think regulators feel more empowered now to go after these, and then they're going to stop it. One of the big things that I just touched on too is also the term of free bet and risk-free bet, those specific terms and themselves as well. Those were ubiquitous in the US. Every single ad was, a risk-free bet. And even today, Caesars is offering in certain markets $1,200 risk, again, risk-free bet. We'll talk about the changes with it. BetMGM, DraftKings, FanDuel, it's pretty standard, do $1,000. Caesars at one point was doing $3,000 for New York when they first went live. It's, those are there with it, but that term also is getting that. So it's explicitly outlawed in Ohio, you or your marketers or anybody else with it. Worth noting that Caesars did attribute the mistake to a third-party affiliate marketer, not their direct advertising. So, they kind of passed the buck a little bit. Anyway, regardless, any company you're affiliated with or touch on, you cannot use those terms anymore in Ohio. Massachusetts is going to do the same thing. And then we're going to see this go in retroactively to other states. Just out of an abundance of precaution, even in states where the terminology is permitted, you're going to see that come back. And they're now using second chance or try again or whatever have you bets. It's that idea, but risk-free, free bet for new players is just going to be gone from the US. And it's an interesting development, again, when that was on every ad for years. Now we're not going to see that. They're going to see that kind of scrambling a little bit, I think, in most markets to change that, just because, again, not every state is the same, but it's something that, so like, for example, Massachusetts, these DraftKings, FanDuel, Caesars, BetMGM, all your big sportsbooks are undergoing licensing review. The regulators are going, well, how come in this state you use that term risk-free bet when we don't permit it? What are you doing? Are you guys trying to circumvent our rules? And I think out of precaution, you're going to see them become much more conservative with it. And I think, again, you're going to see regulators feel strengthened to go after it. Worth noting, this is from a local news report in Ohio, but overall, it's $1 million in fines that Ohio regulators have pursued. And we're in week 2.5 of sports betting in Ohio. Already, they want $1 million going after it. They've gone after BetMGM and DraftKings for similar things, what went on with Caesars. They've gone after Barstool for some of their marketing practices. Again, I think it's a copycat system, and states tend to do what the other states are doing. And I think we'll see just a stronger crackdown on the language used, how these sports books advertise and market. And it's just interesting that after years of kind of running rackshot, and now we're going to see regulators kind of getting their teeth and fighting back.
Yeah, exactly. No longer a free for all and kind of let's make as much money as possible. It'll be interesting to see if Ohio is the outlier, or whether that's the trend now for states that start to regulate. They're going to take a kind of less lenient approach to regulating sports betting. And I do think those New York Times articles played quite a significant part in that, probably because they, as well as the industry itself, they very much put the lobbyists and the regulators under the microscope. And that's likely to have an influence, I'd imagine. Ryan, we've got through a hell of a lot there in about 45 minutes. I think we'll leave it there because there's only so much our audience can take from us. But I just wanted to say thank you to you for joining me, of course. Thank you very much to everybody watching and commenting. Thanks to Phil, our special guest. And of course, a big thank you to our sponsors of this weekly news episode, Pearson. We'll be back next week, and I'm pretty sure we are just about to begin the Q4 reporting period. So for those of you that like numbers, you love the next few weekly newses. And I've been reliably informed Pierre will be joining us because he actually admitted that he loves reading them in his spare time. There we go. Pierre will be back soon. But yeah, thanks to everybody. Have a good rest of the day, and we'll be back next week.
Thanks, guys.
New York, New York, the city that never sleeps, and the gateway to the land of opportunity. A true melting pot where dreams become reality and great ideas come to life. With the U.S. online sports betting and iGaming sectors predicted to generate $10 billion in 2023, there is so much potential to fulfill. The competition is fierce, and nobody said it would be easy. But together, we can make our sector fly. So get ready to learn, connect, and inspire at iGaming Next, New York City.